Okay, so today we're going deep on Gelukpa Tibetan Buddhism. Specifically stuff that comes from Tsongkhapa.
Cool.
I think a lot of people who are into like Buddhist philosophy, they've heard of Gelukpa.
Yeah.
They know that it's like a major school. But what's really fascinating about it is that it's so distinctly nominalist.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about it from a philosophical perspective, right? Because
Absolutely.
it's not just like a little difference. It really shapes their entire worldview.
Yeah,
you know?
totally. And, obviously the centerpiece of the whole Gelukpa thing is their version of the middle way philosophy,
Right.
which is Madhyamaka.
Yes.
And of course, the middle way itself is about finding this balance between essentialism and nihilism.
Right.
Using the two truths.
Uh-huh.
But what's really wild is that the Gelukpa take on it is considered the highest view in Tibet.
Yeah.
It's like they've got this really specific and intricate way of articulating it, and it's super interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it goes back to Nagarjuna, centuries ago, this idea of balancing between inherent existence and utter non-existence.
Yeah.
And the Gelukpa just have this really specific way of going about that.
Totally. So how does that work? I mean, what's their take on the two truths?
Well, the Gelukpa are really big on the consequence school,
Okay.
which is Prasanjika.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the 7th century Indian philosopher Chandrakyupi.
Okay.
And the Prasanjika approach, it's really different than other schools of thought that might try to build like big epistemological systems.
Right.
They don't really do that. Instead, they focus on basically showing how other viewpoints lead to inconsistencies and contradictions.
Okay.
So it's more about like revealing those problems rather than building up their own system.
Interesting.
And they argue for existence basically through the way we actually use and interact with things in our everyday life.
Right.
So it's very practical, and it's all about like transactional usage. So for someone coming from a background in Western philosophy, it's a really refreshing and maybe even a little bit unexpected approach.
Yeah, definitely. So let's get into the two truths.
Okay.
Ultimate truth and conventional truth.
Right.
I think it's really important to emphasize from the get-go that in the Gelukpa system, these aren't seen as separate domains or like levels of reality.
Yeah.
Where one's higher than the other or something like that.
Absolutely.
They're actually totally intertwined, and they depend on each other.
Right. And a really interesting way to think about it is this concept that they're extensionally identical but intentionally distinct.
Okay, what does that mean?
So it's like this, it's a Tibetan phrase, Angobojiglalagbathadad.
Yeah.
And basically what it means is that it's not like there are two different kinds of things out there.
Right.
It's more like there are two different ways of thinking about or engaging with the same thing.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it.
So let's say you've got a table, right? No, it's not like the table exists conventionally and then separately it has this ultimate truth of emptiness.
Right.
The Gelukpa perspective is that the table is empty. Its conventional existence and its ultimate emptiness are not two separate things.
I see.
They're just two aspects of the same reality.
Interesting. So does that mean that for them to exist is to be empty?
Exactly.
And to exist is to exist conventionally?
Right. Both of those statements are true at the same time.
So when they talk about ultimate truth as emptiness, are they talking about like a void or nothingness?
Not really. It's not about like some kind of absolute nothingness or anything.
Okay.
It's more about the idea that when you really analyze any phenomenon, you're not going to find some inherent independent essence there.
Right.
It's something that exists separate from its parts, its causes, or the concepts we use to describe it. It's the very fact that you can't find that inherent essence.
Yeah.
That is what they call emptiness.
So this emptiness, is it like a thing itself?
No, not at all. That's where it gets really interesting. Even this emptiness doesn't have its own inherent independent existence.
Whoa.
It's empty too.
So there's nothing that has this like ultimate essence.
Right. In the Gelukpa system, if something did have a findable ultimate essence, that would make it intrinsically or ultimately real.
Okay.
And their big claim is that nothing at all has that status.
Not even emptiness.
Nope, not even emptiness.
That's so trippy.
And the way they describe this emptiness is really important too.
Okay, how so?
They call it a non-implicative negation, or med-d-gag.
Okay.
And what that means is it's not like a negation that implies something else.
Right.
It's not like saying this isn't inherently real, therefore it must be something else.
Yeah.
It's just a simple absence of inherent existence.
Okay, so it's not that it's something different. It's
Yeah.
just that it doesn't have that inherent essence.
Exactly.
So even this statement that nothing is ultimately real, that ultimate truth is emptiness,
Right.
that itself is a conventional truth.
Exactly. It's just a concept that we use within our shared understanding of the world.
I see.
And this whole idea of emptiness, it doesn't negate our everyday experiences, you know? It's not like it makes everything meaningless or something.
Yeah.
In fact, they see it as the very condition for the possibility of those experiences.
How so?
Well, if everything had this fixed, independent nature, then change and interaction, all that stuff, wouldn't really make sense.
That's true.
But because things are empty, because they lack that inherent essence,
Yeah.
that's what allows for the dynamism of conventional reality.
So it all comes back to this idea of dependent arising.
Exactly. To be empty means to lack that independent, self-sufficient existence.
Right.
And since everything we encounter is dependent on other things,
Yeah.
it relies on causes and conditions, and it's labeled by our concepts. Nothing has that inherent independence.
So everything's empty.
Everything is empty.
Wow. Okay. So to sum it all up for all the philosophy nerds out there, the Gelukpa tradition sees emptiness as the fundamental nature, or I guess the lack of independent nature, of all phenomena. And because of that, everything is necessarily empty.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've covered ultimate truth. Now let's dive into conventional truth and the consequence school.
Okay, sounds good.
You mentioned earlier that the Gelukpa tradition holds the consequence school, or Prasanjika Matamika, in really high regard.
Yeah, they see it as like the most sophisticated form of Buddhist philosophy.
Okay.
And you know what's really interesting about it is its radical anti-foundationalism and anti-realism.
Yeah, that's definitely a departure from a lot of Western philosophy.
For sure.
So can you elaborate on that a bit?
So unlike some other schools of thought that might start with certain axioms or basic principles,
Right.
the consequence school mainly uses these reductio ad absurdum arguments.
Okay.
So basically they try to show that a certain position is empty by showing that it leads to logical contradictions or absurd consequences.
I see.
It's like a way of deconstructing an argument rather than building up their own system.
Interesting. So they don't really try to prove things in a traditional sense?
Exactly. And there's a really good reason for that.
What's that?
Well, Tsongkhapa argued that trying to prove emptiness to someone who really believes in inherent existence is kind of pointless.
Why is that?
Because those kinds of proofs rely on a shared understanding of the concepts you're using.
Right.
They assume that there's this common ground.
Yeah.
But between a realist and an anti-realist, there is no common ground.
It's like trying to have a debate about quantum mechanics with someone who only believes in Newtonian physics.
Exactly. You're just speaking different languages.
So the consequence school basically says, we're not going to pretend like there are these objective facts that we can all agree on.
Right. They don't accept any fixed objective starting point.
Okay, so how do they determine what's true then?
Well, they have this idea called a coherence theory of truth when it comes to conventional reality.
Okay.
Basically, they say that what we consider to be conventionally real is determined by what everyone agrees on.
So it's like a social construct.
In a way, yeah. They often use the phrase, what is renowned in the world.
Interesting. So there are no ultimate foundations for reality.
Nope.
And even our conventional truths aren't based on some objective facts out there.
Right. It's all about how things fit together within our shared practices and experiences.
So truth is about what works.
Exactly. It's about what's effective within a given context.
That's really different from how a lot of people think about truth.
It is, yeah. But it makes a lot of sense when you consider the implications of emptiness and dependent arising.
So are there any criteria for determining what counts as a conventional truth in this system?
Yeah, Tsongkhapa actually lays out 3 specific criteria.
Okay, let's hear them.
So first, a conventional truth has to be acknowledged by a conventional epistemic instrument.
Okay.
Second, it can't be contradicted by another equally valid conventional epistemic instrument.
Right.
And third, and this is really important, it can't be contradicted by an analysis of its ultimate nature.
So basically, you can't show that it's empty.
Exactly. That third criterion is crucial because it shows that just because something is ultimately empty doesn't mean it's not real in a conventional sense.
So we can still interact with it, and it still has meaning in our everyday lives.
Exactly.
Now, I'm sure this whole approach has generated some controversy.
Oh, yeah.
What have other Buddhist schools said about it?
Well, some schools have accused the Gelukpa of being too realist about conventional truth.
So they think they give it too much weight.
Right, and others have accused them of being nihilist about ultimate truth.
Like they think they're saying nothing exists at all.
Yeah, there's been a lot of back and forth about whether they're really striking the right balance.
And I bet there's also been debate about how epistemology fits into all of this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the consequence school is so anti-foundationalist that it can be hard to see how any kind of epistemology can really work within that framework.
So how do they respond to those criticisms?
Well, they double down on this idea of interdependence. They say that even at the conventional level, nothing exists independently.
So even our conventions aren't ultimately grounded.
I mean, they're groundless, too.
And that's why ultimate truth and conventional truth aren't really separate.
Exactly. They're just two sides of the same coin.
So where does the mind-only school fit into all of this?
Okay, so the mind-only school, also known as Siddhamatra, they're a big deal in Buddhist philosophy. And they have this idea that the mind is the ultimate foundation of reality.
Okay.
So the external world is real in a conventional sense.
Right.
But ultimately, it's just a projection of the mind.
I see.
But the Gelukpa, they reject that.
They do?
Yeah. They say that both minds and external objects have the same ontological status.
So neither one is more fundamental than the other.
Exactly. They're both conventionally existent and ultimately non-existent.
And they both depend on each other.
Right. There's this great quote from a later Gelukpa scholar, Kunzang Sonam. He said that the coextensive presence and absence of objects and cognitions actually serves to affirm the conventional reality of external objects.
So the fact that we have cognitions of objects shows that those objects must be real in some sense.
They can't just be figments of our imagination.
So the Gelukpa are walking this really fine line.
They are.
They're affirming the existence of the external world, but they're not saying that it's ultimately real.
Right. They're not idealists because they don't privilege the mind.
Right.
And they're not external realists because they don't say that the external world exists independently of our minds.
So it's this very nuanced middle ground position.
Exactly.
And I think Tsongkhapa's idea of intrinsic characteristic or Rangan Shan helps to clarify this even further.
Yeah, that's a really important concept.
So can you break that down for us?
So Tsongkhapa actually identifies 3 different ways that this term is used in different philosophical systems. In Avtarma, it's used to distinguish a particular instance of something from the general category it belongs to.
So like the heat of a particular fire versus the concept of fire in general.
Exactly. And then in Dharmakirti's epistemology, it's used to distinguish a unique particular from a universal concept.
So like this specific tree versus the concept of tree.
Right. But the third meaning, and the one that's most relevant to the consequence school, is that it refers to the subtle form of reification.
So it's like this mistaken belief that things have their own inherent existence.
Even at the conventional level.
So it's not just about ultimate truth, it's about how we perceive things in our everyday lives.
Exactly. And that's what the consequence school is trying to dismantle.
By showing us that this belief in inherent existence is just an illusion.
Right.
So it all comes back to interdependence.
Always.
This idea that nothing exists in isolation.
Exactly. Everything is connected.
And that brings us back to what you called the king of arguments.
Right. The argument for universal emptiness from interdependence.
Why is that argument so important?
Well, they see it as the most powerful argument for emptiness.
Okay.
Because it doesn't just show that things are empty.
Yeah.
It also shows why they appear the way they do.
I see.
So it avoids both the extreme of nihilism.
Saying that nothing exists.
Right. And the extreme of reification.
Saying that things have inherent existence.
Exactly. It strikes that perfect balance.
So the Gelukpa view of the world is one where emptiness and appearance are inseparable.
Yeah, they're two sides of the same coin.
And they arise together in this interdependent web of relationships.
Exactly.
Now, this raises an interesting philosophical question.
What's that?
If ultimate truth and conventional truth are ultimately not different, does that mean that there's no real distinction between ontology and ethics?
That's a really good question.
Because if everything is interdependent,
right,
then our actions must have an impact on the world in a very direct way.
I see what you're saying. So maybe this anti-realist ground actually provides a more solid foundation for ethics.
Than like a purely consequentialist view.
That's a really interesting idea. It's definitely something to think about.
And it makes me wonder if that's part of why they call it the Geluk tradition, which means way of virtue.
Yeah, it seems like there's a strong connection there between their ontology and their ethics.
Definitely something to explore further.
For sure.
Okay, so moving on, Tsongkhapa made some pretty bold claims about the consequent school.
He did.
He said it was superior to other Buddhist philosophical schools.
Yeah, he was very confident in its correctness.
So what were his main arguments for that?
Well, one of the big ones was their rejection of idealism.
Okay.
So as we talked about before, they don't give any special status to the mind.
Right.
They say that both objects and minds are equally empty and equally dependently arisen.
So there's no foundational consciousness.
Right. Unlike the mind-only school, which says there's this ultimate ground of consciousness that everything arises from, the Gelukpa, they say no, that's just another reification.
So they're saying that the mind-only school is still clinging to a subtle form of self.
Exactly. They're still trying to find something ultimately real.
And what about reflexive awareness?
So reflexive awareness is this idea that consciousness is inherently aware of itself.
Okay.
But the Gelukpa, they say, nope, that doesn't exist either.
So how do they explain how we're aware of our own thoughts and feelings?
They say it's just another form of perception.
So there's no special kind of awareness that's directed inward.
Right. It's all just part of this interdependent web of cause and effect.
And they have some pretty strong arguments against reflexive awareness.
Yeah, they say it leads to all sorts of problems.
Like what?
Well, first of all, it contradicts the principle of interdependence.
Right, because if consciousness is inherently aware of itself,
then it wouldn't need anything else to exist.
It would be independent.
Exactly. And second, it presupposes this idea of direct, unmediated access to truth,
which the Gelukpa reject.
They say that all knowledge is mediated and contingent.
So we can never be absolutely certain about anything.
Right.
And third, they say that reflexive awareness doesn't actually explain anything.
It's just a fancy word for something that we don't really understand.
So for the Gelukpa, reflexive awareness is a philosophical error.
It is.
And it doesn't even exist conventionally.
Nope.
Okay, so another unique feature of the consequent school is this idea of disintegration as an entity.
Right, or zigpa, dingospo.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so this is their way of dealing with the problem of causality.
Okay.
You know how everything is impermanent and everything is constantly changing.
Right.
Well, the question is, how does one thing cause another thing if there are no enduring substances?
I see.
Because if everything is just a collection of fleeting moments, then how can there be any causal connection between those moments?
So what's their solution?
Well, they say that disintegration itself is a real entity.
What? So like the process of something ceasing to exist?
Exactly. They say that that process has causal efficacy.
So it's not just an absence of something.
Right. It's a real thing that can have real effects.
I can see how that could be controversial.
Oh, it definitely is.
It seems like it could be accused of reifying absence.
Yeah, some people have said that it makes emptiness into a thing.
Which is exactly what the Gelukpa are trying to avoid.
Right. It's a delicate balancing act.
It is, but despite all this talk of emptiness, it's important to remember that the Gelukpa don't deny the reality of conventional phenomena.
Right. They're not nihilists.
They affirm the reality of the world and the reality of the person.
Exactly. But they just say that that reality is conventional, not ultimate.
So transformation and liberation for them are not about escaping the world.
No, it's about changing our relationship to it.
By ceasing to superimpose inherent essences on things.
Exactly.
So emptiness is not about negating existence.
Right. It's about negating a specific type of existence.
Inherent existence.
Exactly.
And when they talked about the denial of self, they're not denying the existence of the person.
Right. They're denying the existence of a reified self.
So this idea of a self that's independent and unchanging,
exactly.
They say that's an illusion.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the philosophy.
We have.
But how does this all fit into the broader context of Buddhist soteriology?
So soteriology is the study of liberation.
Right.
And in Buddhism, the idea is that we suffer because we're attached to a false sense of self.
Okay.
And the path to liberation involves realizing that this self is an illusion.
So the Gelukpa philosophy is all about helping us to see through that illusion.
Exactly. And they believe that the consequent school's understanding of emptiness is the key to doing that.
Because it shows us that there's no self to be found anywhere.
Right.
So realizing emptiness is not just an intellectual exercise.
It's a path to liberation.
And it's also a prerequisite for engaging in tantric practices.
That's right. Tantra is a very important part of the Gelukpa tradition.
And it requires a strong foundation in the view of emptiness.
Yeah, you can't really practice Tantra effectively without understanding emptiness.
So the Gelukpa philosophy is both theoretical and practical.
It is.
It's about understanding the nature of reality.
And using that understanding to transform ourselves.
And what's interesting is that their approach to overcoming these mistaken beliefs is very grounded in reason and debate.
Yeah, they're not big on mystical experiences or anything like that.
It's all about carefully analyzing the world and using logic to arrive at the truth.
Exactly. They believe that reasoned analysis is the key to understanding emptiness.
And that's why they place so much emphasis on debate.
Right. Debate is not just an academic exercise for them.
It's a way of training the mind.
And of sharpening our understanding of these complex philosophical concepts.
So in the Gelukpa system, simply letting go or engaging in non-conceptual meditation is not enough.
No, you need to cultivate insight through reason.
Because that's what allows you to see through the illusion of inherent existence.
Right.
So true insight is not about transcending thought.
No, it's about understanding the world as it is.
Which is neither ultimately existent nor conventionally non-existent.
Exactly. It's about finding that middle ground.
And while they acknowledge that highly realized meditators might have non-conceptual experiences of emptiness, they say that emptiness is ultimately the same as the emptiness that can be understood through reason.
Right. It's not like there are two different kinds of emptiness.
So the distinction between conceptual and perceptual knowledge is not so clear-cut in their system.
Not really.
Because if everything is ultimately empty, then everything is in some sense conceptually designated.
Right.
So the conceptual ascertainment of emptiness is a really important part of the Gelukpa path.
It is, and they also emphasize that reason should be prioritized over scripture.
So even the Buddha's words are subject to scrutiny.
Exactly. They say you should never just blindly accept something just because it's in a text.
You should always use your own reason to evaluate it.
Absolutely.
Now, I know the Gelukpa tradition also had a huge impact on education in Tibet.
They did. They established these massive monastic universities.
And they developed a very rigorous curriculum.
Yeah, they really set the standard for Buddhist scholarship.
So what were the main subjects that they studied?
Well, there were 5 main topics. Right. Metaphysics, or abhidharma.
Okay.
Epistemology, or pramana, negative dialectics, or madhyamaka.
Which we've been talking about this whole time.
Exactly. And then there's the structure of the path to enlightenment, which is based on a text called the Apisamailankara.
Okay.
And finally, ethics, or Vinaya.
So basically everything you need to know to become an enlightened Buddhist.
Pretty much.
So how did these subjects all fit together?
Well, metaphysics gave you the overall Buddhist worldview.
Yeah.
The path structure showed you the goal you were aiming for.
Right.
Ethics told you how to behave along the way. And then epistemology and negative dialectics gave you the tools to really understand reality.
So they were like the intellectual core of the curriculum.
Exactly.
And I think it's interesting that they started with epistemology.
Yeah, they believed it was important to have a solid foundation in how we know things.
Before you could really start to deconstruct those beliefs.
Right.
And they used debate as a primary method of teaching.
Yeah, debate was seen as a way of really internalizing these complex ideas.
Not just memorizing them.
Exactly. It was about really understanding them on a deep level.
So Buddha's epistemology, as you mentioned, draws heavily on the work of Dharmakirti.
It does.
And his system is often described as anti-realist or conceptualist.
Yeah, meaning that he didn't think that language and concepts could perfectly capture reality.
Okay.
But the Gelukpa, they developed a more nuanced view of universals.
So universals are like these general concepts that apply to many particular things.
Right, like the concept of tree or redness.
Okay.
And Dharmakirti, he basically said that universals are unreal.
They don't exist.
Well, they exist conventionally, but not ultimately.
Great.
But the Gelukpa, they took a kind of middle ground position.
They did.
Yeah, they said that universals are real.
But they don't exist independently of particulars.
Exactly. They use that phrase we talked about before, extensionally identical, but intentionally distinct,
right,
to describe this relationship.
So a universal is like a way of talking about a certain feature that's shared by many particulars.
Exactly.
But it doesn't exist as a separate thing.
Right. It's just a concept that we use to make sense of the world.
So while the Gelukpa studied Dharmakirti's epistemology very closely, their own view was ultimately shaped by the nominalism of the consequence school.
Exactly. They believed that the middle way was the highest view.
Okay, so to wrap things up for our listeners,
sure,
we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about the Gelukpa tradition's unique interpretation of the middle way, the two truths,
right,
their commitment to the consequence school,
yeah,
their rejection of idealism and reflexive awareness, their interesting idea of disintegration as an entity.
Right.
And their emphasis on reason and debate as paths to understanding emptiness.
Yeah, it's a really rich and complex tradition.
It is. So as a final thought for our listeners to ponder,
okay,
given the Gelukpa emphasis on reason and the interdependence of all things, how might their philosophy inform our understanding of contemporary philosophical debates about truth, reality, and ethics?
That's a great question.
It seems like there's a lot of potential there for cross-cultural dialogue and engagement.
Absolutely. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to check out some of the primary sources we've mentioned today.
Yeah, or to explore the concepts of emptiness and dependent arising further.
There's a whole world of philosophical insight waiting to be discovered in the Gelukpa tradition.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Gelukpa philosophy.
It was my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.